How is spring migration different than fall migration? That's what we're going to talk about today. You may think that spring migration and fall migration are basically the same thing, northbound, southbound, but this is Jill from the North Woods, and we're going to talk a little bit about how it is more exciting and different. Fall migration has its own rhythm, challenges, surprises. It's not just a reverse journey back to where they were in the South. So the first part is when you think about spring migration, the main driver of spring migration is reproduction. The birds are racing northwards to claim territory, build a nest, attract mates, and start laying eggs. And the early bird at least gets maybe a worm, but gets the best nest real estate. The urgency means that spring migration is usually faster, more direct, and more competitive. In the fall, the urgency shifts. The breeding is done, the chicks have fledged, and the next challenge is survival. The birds start heading south to avoid cold weather and to find food. You can always tell when birds either migrate north to this neck of the woods in the North Woods or south because seabirds need seeds. And there are still seeds sitting out in yards, in farm fields, but eventually they have to go and find fresher, seed food. Bugs start getting cold this time of year. Right now we're having lows in the mid 40s and the bugs are dying out. They're not as active. I can walk through the woods and not get eaten by mosquitoes like I would have just a few weeks ago. So it depends on what the birds are eating. Are they bug birds or are they seed birds or do they have flexibility? But they rush basically to keep eating and keep getting the food. But they're not really racing to beat out the competition. They're really looking to go to that safe winter home. So the motivation changes everything about the way that the spring and fall migration act. Spring migration is more like a sprint. Like I said, we got to get up there and go. Fall migration is more like a road trip. In spring, some species cover about 300 to 500 miles in a single flight. And in fall, the birds take their time, stopping off, refueling. If they find foods, if they find fields with foods, if they find bugs, they might just stick around for a little bit and then keep moving south as the cold weather comes in. They may even delay their departure, waiting for good winds, or maybe the food is just too good right now. We're not going to leave that. The shorebirds like to leave early, and that's one of the first things we see to go. We see sparrows gathering. In fact, Em and I went out hiking last week, and we saw hundreds. It just had to be hundreds and hundreds of swallows that were all gathered up in a swarm, not where they usually were in this marsh that I go to, but instead over the fields. They're gathering up to go south on their trip. Things like the Hudsonian godwit might go 4,000 miles nonstop, and that's from Canada to South America, going through the United States, while warblers and thrushes will go in smaller hops, smaller distances, pausing to find bugs or gorge on berries, that kind of thing. We did notice that the cormorants were gathered up. Like I said, the swallows were gathered up. We have chimney swifts right now, which will go into the chimneys for a short period of time and then head out. So spring migration feels like it's a little flashier. The males are in their bright colors, their breeding plumages. Right now, a lot of the colors come out of the males. And so if you're thinking about mallards, they're all brown. They used to have confusions that they thought that the birds were either burying themselves in the ground or all became female, but instead they just lose their color. There's a lot of birds that we'll see bright yellow in the spring and summer, and then they turn all black and brown when it's coming to the winter time. They're trying to attract a mate in the spring, but in the fall, it's quieter. Not many birds have their full color. The young birds are going to be making their first trip south, and the calls are not the same. I went out like I said, with them for the last 2 weeks, bird watching, and we probably did 8 hours each Saturday. They weren't calling like they usually did. There were some. The peewees were still calling, which is kind of cute and adorable. But most of the birds were not doing their normal call. They have a non-breeding call, and so sometimes it's very hard to recognize them in the fall migration because they're a little bit different than they were. Like I said, some of these young birds are making their first journey south. They're going to follow with the flock in some cases, and it's easier to confuse birds, quite honestly. Bird watching, particularly warblers, become a real identification problem just because they don't have that particular coloring to them. The American goldfinches look yellow in spring, and they sort of become like an olive brown in fall, blending in with the dried grass, and you might not even recognize them to the degree that you normally do. Another big difference between the fall migration and the spring migration is the number of birds. In spring, it's just the adults coming back up north to breed. In fall, you have adults and they're brand new young. And we saw in a pond 7 wood ducks all huddled together. Normally, you don't see wood ducks in large numbers like we saw because you usually just have a pair. And now the pair had their young, and now their young are all hanging out together. They're heading down south. So it's going to be a bigger migration. It's going to look like a big parade, huge flocks of blackbirds, starlings, geese, and in some places, report almost twice as many birds in the fall than they did in the spring migration because of all the young travelers. In places like up here in the North Woods, Duluth and Minnesota, Wisconsin, hawks funnel down the shore of Lake Superior in the fall, and some people call it a hawk river in the sky because so many hawks are headed south. The spring routes are often shorter and more direct. Like I said, the birds want to get there more directly as birdly possible. And in the fall, the routes, like I said, can shift. They can go side to side. They can hug the coastline. They can make more of a zigzag down south. They're following the weather, and they don't have that urgency that they do. Raptors, in particular, avoid crossing big bodies of water in fall. Instead, they funnel along ridges, coasts, and it makes them easier to spot, too, in the fall. I noticed that, like I said, the cormorants were heading south. I did not see them in large groups of numbers coming up in the spring, but now they're all banded together and headed south. There's some species that even take a different route south than north, and they call that a loop migration. The blackpoll warblers weigh less than half an ounce, but will fly nonstop over the Atlantic in the fall from New England, to South America, and that's one of the longest water flights of any songbirds at all. The other night, we had 11 million birds fly over my area, and a lot of them were warblers. We're starting to see a few warblers here and there. We only had, when we went out bird watching the last 2 weeks, a Tennessee warbler. And in the spring, they do a call that's sort of Tennessee, C, and now he wasn't doing that at all. It was a completely different call. Merlin recognized it. I didn't. When the spring migration happens, you get hazards like late snowstorms, cold rain, maybe the lack of food when they stop over, or they get to a particular area and then a big snowstorm comes in and all the food is covered up if they're seed birds. So it can be quite hazardous. But in the fall, the hazard's a little bit different. First of all, you have many young, inexperienced birds who are facing the big bad world all at the same time, and they are just not experienced as much. You'll see like baby birds in this time of year. I have some baby birds, woodpeckers, in my backyard that are pecking on a metal pole because they just don't know better. They're brand new, and so they're just learning about the world around them. But when we have these migrations, like I said, they're just not as experienced. And so these young birds can be quite confused at times. Spring migration, like I said, noisy. Birds are singing constantly. They're trying to establish territory. They're trying to attract a mate. Fall, like I said, very quiet. It was very, very quiet when we were bird watching these past 2 weekends. We found a good number of birds looking for them, but it was more visual, and it was basically sitting in a particular spot and watching the birds crisscross across this area of trees to the left and trees to the right, and they kept flying back and forth. It was very silent. It was very chilly in the morning, and it took a long time before they got up and started moving, so it's a kind of a different MO too. Usually in the summertime, you wanna get bird watching, crack of dawn, early thing, but now it's a slower morning. They are a little bit more relaxed than they used to be. So, it was, an interesting time watching these birds and just seeing hundreds of birds, hundreds of pelicans, hundreds of swallows being very quiet. And usually on these autumn nights, you might even hear the basically flight calls overhead, and it's a very quiet sort of thing. We get, like I said, the swallows, the swifts that fly over at night. A lot of the smaller birds do fly at night because it's safer. The hawks and the big the big birds don't mind. They don't care. They can fly anytime and it's fine, and they tend to fly more times during the day. The couple weeks ago, we had the common nighthawks fly over, and they go in huge swirling flocks at dusk, and people will report, "Oh, over at this park, if you go to this park, you can see them sort of a cloud in the sky." If it's like, a moon showing, you can kinda see them up against the moon. The ruby-throated hummingbirds, they will bulk up on nectar. They try to double their weight, and then they'll fly across the Gulf of Mexico in a single night. The sandhill cranes were starting to gather by a pretty good group, but not quite there yet, here at least yet, and then they'll fly in the thousands, filling the air with, the call. And you can hear them at night, at least in my house. If I have the windows open, I can hear the cranes, the ducks, and the, geese all calling at night when they're flying over. So, fall migration, like I said, it reminds us of the whole cycle. The birds are continuing their rhythm of going down south and coming back north that has helped these species. I was reading a book, and it was suggesting that they think that possibly migration started happening initially because it was avoiding disease in a particular area, and then they go into another place to avoid, gaining diseases that would happen in their winter homes, fly up north, and it helped the birds survive, have a little bit more, mating diversity, so you're not, like, dating your brother and sister kinda thing. But these are perilous trips, right? We have to they have to get not only to their destination and have habitats in their destinations, but they have to have the habitats all along the way. Places to stop, wetlands, feeding areas all along that path. So it's not just about protecting the places where birds breed or protecting the places where the birds hang out for the winter, but also protecting the places that they go in between. So it's a kind of different thing. And these migrations are written into their DNA. They have all sorts of sensory things with magnetic, star mapping that tells them which direction to go. And it's a very complicated kind of thing. Now, I have to admit, migration in the fall makes me a little sad because all these birds, 11 million of them, flying all the way to the south, not here anymore. And we're not going to see them again until we're thinking like March, April, May of next year. And so some of them will stay, a few of them will stay all year long. We get geese that stay all year long. We get some sandhill cranes that will stay here all year round. But for the most part, the warblers, the geese, the swallows, everything else just goes. And then what we have here normally has to do with birds that stay all year long. which will be cardinals, blue jays, crows, and they probably are glad to get rid of all the competition for food and everything else. But the other part of it too is that when these birds do migrate to the south, they follow a rhythm that there is, like I said, it's built into shortening days, colder temperatures, hormones, shifts in body fat for them, and the scientists call this migratory restlessness. That even caged birds, they say, will start to get a little fluttery, and I have not seen this in my own bird, but we'll kind of get that way so that they experience kind of they know their time has come to go and migrate. And like I said, some of it has to do with daylight and everything else. But like I said, there are some birds that stay here all year long. They are going to be birds that have a bigger diversity of food they eat. They will stay here, not just eating bugs, because the bugs are going to be gone soon entirely because it's going to get too cold, but they can eat flowers, seed, fruit. There's still berries on trees, and so the ones that will stay are the ones that have that ability to eat different kinds of food. And it works for them because there's less competition, there's less places, predators they have to worry about because most of them have already headed south. And I kind of wondered myself, what do they do when they're in their winter homes, sometimes in the Gulf Coast, northern Mexico, southern Mexico, even South America? What are they doing down there? Do they think it's weird? This is my friend's thought, that so half the time they see squirrels and chipmunks, and the other half the time they see monkeys and sloths and things like that. Must be kind of interesting to them. Most birds do not have a winter brood, but instead will only reproduce, like I said, during the summertime and do it up north. Barn swallows might also nest in South America. Ospreys nest in North America, but some of them also have populations in South America. So they do nest and have young. Tropical residents like toucans and parrots, they don't migrate at all, so they're there all year long. And there are a few that will be double breeders, meaning that they'll have a nest down south, and then they'll also have a nest up here as well. So there's a few of them, but not many of them. So I guess the idea is that you think of the fact that the north and the north woods are nurseries to birds, while the south is just a refuge, place to hang out, eat food, stick together, stay protected, and survive in a warmer climate. There are places that are like Arctic terns. They nest in the Arctic during summertime, and then they fly all the way down to the Antarctic for the winter time. So they live basically in a permanent summer in cold areas. They travel about 25,000 miles a year. So it's a pretty extensive trip. The northern breeding grounds are nice because we have longer daylight hours, less competition than the tropics, which has a lot of different species and things that live down there. And we have a huge supply of food in the summertime, bugs, seeds, growing things. When they're down south, there's a lot of competition, an abundant number of food sources available to them down south in the wintertime for their growing young. And like I said, think about it more as survival when they're down south. There are a few, like I said, birds that will have two broods. Barn swallows will populate both in North and South America. Ospreys mostly breed in North America, but some of them do have a population down south. And there are some desert birds that will go into desert lowlands and have a winter brood out there. Tropical residents like parrots and toucans, they have broods down south, they stay there, and the food is constantly available to them. And there's some birds that just live entirely different lives. If we think about the orioles in the summertime, they are in the backyards of people, having nectar. People put out fruit and oranges for them, eating insects. But in the wintertime, they're hanging out with the monkeys and the parrots in Central America and just kind of living different kinds of lives entirely. And some of them will even have different kinds of food. And the tanagers and the orioles, while they're up north, they're eating backyard fruit. They're eating some small bugs. They weave nests and look for jelly feeders. A lot of people put out jelly and fruit for them. But when they're in the south, in Central America, they eat different kinds of fruits. Like they'll raid banana plantations and hang out in the cocoa and coffee groves. Rose-breasted grosbeaks are here, and they're beautiful, and they have the bold red patch on their chest. They have a beautiful song. But in the south, they disappear into the tropics. They eat fruit and seeds in the South America, and they're often seen with mixed flocks of toucans, antbirds, and hang out with an entirely different crowd. If you think about the black and white warbler, it will creep up and down tree trunks, almost like a woodpecker, looking for bugs in the trees when they're up here in the North Woods. But in the winter times, they spend their time in the mangroves, the tropical forests, and search for bark insects there. The Swanson's thrush, which we have here, will breed in the forest, sing a song, which it sounds like a flute. They have a different kind of throat that allows two tones to be, existing as they sing. But in the wintertime, they're in the Andes in South America, sometimes in elevations above 10,000 feet, fitting in with everything that they have. Bobolinks are birds that we have in the grasslands. They have a really bubbly song. They hover in the fields, but while they're in the south, in Argentina, they're known as rice birds and pampas grass birds because that's what they eat when they're down south. The blackpoll warblers, they nest in the boreal forests of Canada. They visit here shortly, but then they fly that nonstop flight across the Atlantic and South America, and they're quiet there. Then they have flocks that they hang out with, different tanagers and flycatchers. So it's kind of an interesting thought that while they're here, they're having different kinds of lives than what they're having when they go to South and Central America. But there are a few birds that do come back here to the North Woods. The dark-eyed juncos will suddenly start appearing at feeders here when the cold sets in. They're all summer long in the boreal forests of Canada, and then they come here. So we're their summer location. American tree sparrows are winter birds in my neck of the woods. They nest up in the Arctic, and then in the wintertime, they come into my area of the woods, and they look for forests and patchy, weedy areas, and they're just kind of fun to see again. The rough-legged hawk breeds in the Arctic Circle and then comes back to the North Woods where I'm at for wintertime. So we're balmy to them. And they're called that because their legs are very feathered in a way that makes them look like toes, fuzzy legs, but they are adapted to cold climates. We also get something called snow buntings. They are little sparrows, like things that are all white. They breed in the Arctic in summertime, and then they winter in farm fields right around here. So Em and I will go out, drive around farm fields, and usually we can find flocks of snow buntings. And they like to hang out with Lapland longspurs, another tundra breeder that comes back here in the wintertime, and they will hang out in farm fields. They will also hang out with farm fields with horned larks. And horned larks, again, another smaller bird. And when you see them, they'll have kind of horns. I'll try to get a picture up here on their head. That's why they're called horned larks, because it looks like their feathers are horned. Then we also get northern shrikes that come back here. They migrate down from Canada. They set up winter hunting areas in shrub fields, shrubby areas, and they are hunters. So they'll go after mice and other small birds. And they're pretty rough, but we have seen them from time to time. hanging out on telephone wires looking for their next attack. Then we'll get even some owls that come back here. The snowy owl, which is all white. Last year we had a snowy owl that was not terribly far from where I live, and we got a chance to watch him or her, it was a her, for a while. And she was out kind of hanging out in this one particular area looking for prey. So she will come down. The northern southward owl, which is just a tiny little secretive owl, just adorable, will come out and be found in our woods. And so there are birds that do come back and migrate here. So I'm not entirely alone with all the cardinals, blue jays, and crows, but it'll be fun to watch. I hope this gives you an idea a little bit different that fall migration and spring migration are two different things. And so my challenge to you is, what comes to you in wintertime? What leaves you in fall? So kind of get an idea for what kinds of population changes you get when the seasons change. All right, everyone, thanks so much. I appreciate you watching and listening. I hope this is exciting to you, that you can know a little bit more about the birds that are around you. I know that this is kind of an American focused podcast in particular, but I'm sure that every place is very similar to that. I know in England, birds will come down into Africa and come back up in spring again. In Southeast Asia and Australia, they migrate north and south as well. So you have, wherever you live, the same kind of mechanics going on. So try to find out what is leaving and coming when it's coming to wintertime. Please remember that you can email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. I'd love to hear from you. And I hope your spring migration was wonderful, but be excited about the fall migration too. Have a great day.